What if the most brutal regime in modern history was built on secrets it couldn't afford to admit? Behind the uniforms, beneath the slogans, inside the very heart of the Third Reich, whispers swirled. Of loyalty too intense, of bonds too private, of men who punished what they may have lived. Tonight, we dig through the contradictions, betrayals, and buried truths. This isn't just history, it's hypocrisy in jackboots. These are 25 Nazis who were secretly gay, and the secrets didn't die with them. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe if you're into deep, unsettling history that doesn't flinch. It helps us keep digging. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see who else is wandering into the dark tonight. 1. Ernst Röhm. For a man so crucial to Hitler's rise, Ernst Röhm met a strangely quiet end, soaked in cigarette smoke, half undressed, and shot in a hotel room he hadn't asked for. Röhm was the only Nazi leader who lived like he didn't care who knew he was gay. He had male lovers, wrote about them, traveled with them, appointed them to power. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't even a problem, until it was. In the early 1930s, Röhm ran the SA like a personal militia of brown-shirted loyalists. He drank hard, fought harder, and held a kind of locker room authority that blended homoerotic camaraderie with militant hierarchy. For years, Hitler turned a blind eye. Röhm was too useful, too brutal, too loyal. But loyalty in Nazi Germany had a short shelf life, and when Röhm's power started to eclipse the Führer's comfort level, everything changed. The Night of the Long Knives wasn't just a purge, it was moral theater. Röhm's sexuality became a scripted excuse for state-sanctioned betrayal. The regime labeled him a deviant to justify a bullet. And the strange part, it worked. The public swallowed the narrative without choking. The headlines did what the gunshots started. They erased the man, replaced him with a cautionary tale. Of course, the purge didn't end the hypocrisy, it only buried it under medals and silence. Because Ernst Röhm wasn't the only one holding secrets in a uniform. Just ask the man lying dead next to him. 2. Edmund Heines. If Röhm was the symbol, Edmund Heines was the scandal. Younger, sharper-jawed, more openly entangled, Heines wasn't just Röhm's rumored lover. He was the poster boy for everything the SS wanted erased. Heines strutted through SA ranks with the smugness of a man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. For a while, they didn't. A former judge turned executioner, Heines climbed fast. He liked uniforms, discipline, and power, especially in combination. His private life? Less private than one might expect. Stories circulated of parties, photographs, locked doors in Munich villas. By Nazi standards, he wasn't just gay, he was unashamed. And that was the bigger crime. When the SS raided the Bad Wassi Hotel in June 1934, they found Heines in bed with another man. That's the version the Nazis wanted people to remember. Clean, cinematic, scandalous enough to distract from the politics. He was dragged out and shot without trial. Not for treason, for image management. What's left is a haunting irony. The very regime that built its identity on purity depended on men it would later murder for impurity. Edmund Heines was expendable, but the lie his death protected was permanent. And that lie? It didn't end in a hotel room. It marched on, pressed and polished into the ranks of the next man. If you're still with us after that, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? We want to know who else is up late chasing shadows. 3. Karl Ernst. By 1934, Karl Ernst had everything a Nazi officer could want: rank, power, and proximity to the fire. As SA leader in Berlin, he organized marches that looked like military theater and spoke with a voice that mimicked conviction. But behind the uniform was a man stitched together by rumor and opportunity. Ernst was one of the many names whispered in SA corridors during the moral purging of the Night of the Long Knives. According to Nazi propagandists, he was caught en route to a honeymoon with another man. According to historians, he was more likely caught between the ambitions of Röhm and the suspicions of Himmler. Either way, he didn't last long. Whether or not he actually engaged in same-sex relationships remains buried under propaganda and silence. What's clear is that Ernst became another body used to justify the regime's claim to moral superiority, another example of how queerness was politically useful when it needed to be condemned. He died not because he broke rules, but because the rules kept changing. And in the Reich, changing rules always came with a firing squad. The hypocrisy? It didn't stop with Ernst, because his replacement wasn't exactly squeaky clean either. 4. Viktor Lutze. Viktor Lutze had one job: make the SA boring again. After the flamboyance of Röhm and the accusations swirling around Ernst, Hitler needed someone quieter, simpler, unthreatening. Lutze delivered all three, on the surface. He didn't look like a man of secrets, which is exactly why he may have had them. Historians haven't proven that Lutze engaged in same-sex relationships. But the timing of his promotion, so soon after the execution of Röhm and Ernst, sparked murmurs. Some noted his unusually close ties to Röhm even after the regime turned on him. Others found his sudden rise less about merit and more about silence. He didn't ask questions. He didn't inspire many either. Lutze's leadership was defined by obedience, not charisma. And in the reshaped SA, that was enough. His death in a car accident in 1943 was framed as tragic, but emotionally, it barely registered. He'd become what the Nazis wanted, a shadow in uniform. Still, even shadows leave traces. And sometimes the ones standing furthest from suspicion are the ones hiding the most. Just ask the man who once prosecuted moral crimes while dodging the same whispers himself. 5. Hans Frank. Hans Frank spent most of his life pretending to be more pious than powerful. A lawyer by trade and a governor by appointment, he liked to quote scripture in between death warrants. He styled himself as a man of order, of faith, of moral superiority, at least until Nuremberg shattered the illusion. But even before the war ended, whispers clung to Frank like old dust. Nazi rivals called him morally unfit, a vague euphemism that meant something very specific in party slang. Accusations floated through party circles, of secret rendezvous, of effeminate behavior, of quiet preferences. None were confirmed, and maybe none needed to be. In Nazi Germany, being suspected was often punishment enough. What makes Frank's story so sharp is the contrast. Here was a man who spent years lecturing others on sin, declaring who was clean and who was corrupt, while allegedly hiding something he knew the regime would never forgive. Whether true or slander, the rumor stuck. And yet, Frank was never purged. He outlasted Röhm, Heines, Ernst, all of them. Maybe he played the game better. Or maybe he knew how to weaponize denial. But not everyone had Frank's talent for moral camouflage. Some just leaned into their image, like the next man, who led children and maybe followed instincts he wasn't supposed to have. 6. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach was the fresh-faced face of Hitler Youth, the man trusted with shaping Germany's next generation of perfect Aryans. He quoted Goethe, wore his uniform too well, and spoke to teenage boys like he was already one of them. But behind his tidy rhetoric and polished smile were rumors that never stopped circling. Within party ranks, whispers followed him. Not of crimes exactly, just of emotional over-attachments, too intimate friendships with male youth leaders, a certain tone in letters. It was all vague, all deniable, all just enough to make his colleagues uncomfortable, but not enough to remove him. That's what made him useful. Plausible innocence paired with absolute loyalty. His image was untouchable, even if his private life wasn't. He knew how to say the right words, knew when to look away. And maybe that's why the rumors stayed rumors. Nothing confirmed, but nothing forgotten either. Because von Schirach wasn't alone. There was someone even higher up, someone closer to the Führer, whose private life drew even darker speculation. 7. Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's deputy, his ghostly second-in-command, the man who signed laws into being and then vanished into the fog of history with a strange flight to Scotland and a silence that lasted decades. But long before that surreal solo mission, Hess had already earned a reputation, not just for loyalty, but for something more complicated. Inside Nazi circles, Hess was mocked as effeminate. Colleagues referred to him in diminutives behind his back. Some described his relationships with male aides as devotional. He was awkward around women, withdrawn, obsessed with astrology and personal rituals. He preferred the company of younger men, and his correspondence often had an emotional undertone that didn't go unnoticed. Was any of it concrete? No. But in a regime that weaponized image, Hess became an open secret, tolerated, ignored, and quietly ridiculed. His strange behavior made him easy to exclude from the macho inner circle, and easy to scapegoat when needed. He became a myth, not a man. And like all myths, his real self was obscured by layers of invention. But while Hess floated into legend, another man buried the whispers early, by turning them into weapons of his own. 8. Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich didn't just survive Nazi politics. He dominated them with a blade in one hand and a dossier in the other. He was cold, brilliant, ambitious, and almost certainly the most feared man in the Reich. But early in his career, Heydrich faced something few dared mention publicly: a rumor. In the early SS, when power was still being carved up like meat at a banquet, rivals spread stories about Heydrich. They said he'd been blackmailed over a youthful affair with another man, that his marriage was arranged as a cover, that there were photos somewhere. None of it was ever proven, and most historians believe the rumors were tactical, not truthful. But it didn't matter. What mattered was how Heydrich responded. By becoming the architect of purity, the enforcer of moral standards, the destroyer of those accused of the very thing he'd once been accused of himself. He used the same gossip that almost sank him to justify mass executions. And in doing so, he created the prototype for a new kind of Nazi, one who hid behind rules he wrote himself. But even Heydrich took orders, and the man giving those orders had his own strange obsessions, starting with an army built around brotherhood. 9. Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler built the SS to be the purest of the pure, an elite brotherhood molded in his image, sterilized of weakness, sealed off from temptation. At least, that was the idea. In practice, it looked a lot like a carefully controlled homosocial cult, built on rituals, uniforms, blood oaths, and intense male bonding. It was purity obsessed with itself. Himmler publicly condemned homosexuality as a threat to German survival. Privately, he surrounded himself with handsome young officers, fostered an environment of obsessive male hierarchy, and designed living quarters where men could bond undisturbed. The SS was many things: bureaucratic, brutal, fanatical, but it was also unusually fixated on internal loyalty between men. Some historians have noted that Himmler's ideological fear of homosexuality bordered on projection. Others see his obsession as psychological overcompensation, crushing the thing he couldn't quite name. There's no evidence he was gay, but there's plenty of evidence he couldn't stop thinking about it. And those thoughts? They infected everything: policy, purges, and even the fringe mystics he brought into the fold. Like one man whose ideas about masculinity read more like fantasy than doctrine. 10. Julius Streicher. If the Nazi regime had a resident grotesque, it was Julius Streicher. Gaudy, theatrical, obsessed with sex, and constantly veering into scandal, he ran the Der Stürmer newspaper like a tabloid stitched together from paranoia and projection. His rants were cartoonish, his fixations exhausting. But beneath the shock headlines, there was something stranger. Rumors trailed Streicher like cigarette smoke. Some claimed he had peculiar tastes in private. Others whispered about young men, odd parties, strange encounters in Nuremberg. His enemies in the party, a long list, accused him of moral deviance repeatedly, and not just as a political tool. Even fellow Nazis found his behavior hard to stomach. Yet Hitler protected him. Why? Maybe Streicher's vulgarity served a purpose. Maybe he said the quiet part too loud so others didn't have to. Or maybe Hitler saw something familiar in him, a distorted reflection of instincts he didn't speak about. Because just beyond Streicher's grotesquerie stood a mystic advisor, one who believed masculinity was sacred, mythic, and oddly intimate. 11. Karl Maria Wiligut. Karl Maria Wiligut didn't march. He chanted. Known in SS circles as Himmler's Rasputin, Wiligut wasn't a military man. He was a mystic, a self-declared heir to ancient Germanic wisdom, and a man who claimed to recall thousands of years of ancestral memories. Most of it sounded like folklore on acid, but Himmler believed every word. What made Wiligut peculiar, even by Nazi standards, wasn't just the mythology, it was the tone of it. His sacred texts idealized male comradeship with poetic urgency. He wrote about male warriors bonding through fire and blood, their connection more spiritual than strategic. His vision of masculinity was drenched in intimacy, brotherhood so intense it blurred into something else entirely. To some historians, Wiligut's mythology reads like sublimated longing, devotion disguised as doctrine. It was never openly sexual, but it carried a charged reverence for male closeness, often to the exclusion of everything else. Himmler granted him an SS rank and placed him in charge of the cultic architecture at Wewelsburg Castle. Because in a regime obsessed with strength, even longing could be weaponized, especially if it dressed itself in myth. And Wiligut wasn't the only one spinning fantasy. There was another man in a tailored suit surrounded by secrets who ran the Abwehr like it was his private theater. 12. Wilhelm Canaris. Wilhelm Canaris lived in shadows and spoke in riddles. As head of the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence, he ran an empire of misdirection. He was elegant, distant, and always several moves ahead, even when the game turned on him. But behind the strategic fog lay a question that no one could answer cleanly. Who was Canaris loyal to, really? Rumors circled, even within his own ranks. He kept a circle of young male officers unusually close. His relationships with them were quiet but intense, marked by personal protection, long conversations behind closed doors, and a level of trust that felt more like intimacy than protocol. Some SS insiders found it suspicious, too soft, too emotional. Of course, Canaris was also part of the German resistance. Whether his closeness with his aides was affection, attraction, or just deeply layered trust, no one knows. But in a regime where personal loyalty was usually a mask for something else, the question never really went away. And it wasn't just officers under suspicion. Even Nazi administrators, paper pushers with power, carried their own strange reputations. 13. Hans Bibo. Hans Bibo didn't command armies or write manifestos. He managed paperwork. Specifically, he ran the Lodz ghetto, efficiently, ruthlessly, and with an almost clerical detachment. He was the kind of man who profited from cruelty without raising his voice. But even in the world of Nazi bureaucracy, something about Bibo set off quiet speculation. Post-war testimonies, fragmented, whispered, half-forgotten, hinted at a peculiar closeness between Bibo and certain male subordinates. Nothing scandalous in isolation. But the tone of his relationships, overly protective, strangely intimate, caught the attention of those who worked around him. Some claimed his favoritism ran deeper than professional loyalty. Others simply called it odd. None of it was ever confirmed. But in a regime that demanded emotional distance, Bibo's interpersonal warmth looked suspicious. Not criminal, just out of place. Which, in Nazi Germany, could be fatal if it came to the wrong ears. But Bibo, unlike many others, died outside a courtroom, untried by history, unstudied by most. Still, his name lingers among the quietly strange. And he wasn't the only one rumored to have shared something more than loyalty with the man at the top. 14. Emil Maurice. Emil Maurice was more than Hitler's chauffeur. He was his confidant, bodyguard, and one of the few early Nazis allowed into Hitler's personal sphere. They shared long drives, late-night talks, and years of intimate proximity during the party's formative chaos. In photographs, Maurice often stands just behind Hitler, close, always watching, always trusted. Rumors about their relationship began as whispers in party backrooms. Maurice was attractive, younger, and fiercely devoted. The way Hitler protected him, especially when the SS tried to remove Maurice for having Jewish ancestry, only fed the speculation. Hitler intervened personally, an unusual move that baffled even his inner circle. Was it friendship? Sentimentality? Something unspoken? No one could say. But the emotional intensity of their bond was undeniable, and in a regime built on iron hierarchy, such closeness raised eyebrows. Maurice faded from political prominence, but not from Hitler's protective shadow. His survival was an exception to every rule the Nazis claimed to live by. And as the war dragged on, more of those contradictions emerged, especially in the quiet, affectionate notes exchanged by decorated officers. 15. Max Wünsch. Max Wünsch was the kind of officer Nazi propaganda loved. Young, disciplined, photogenic. A rising star in the Waffen-SS, he served under Hitler directly and was later entrusted with commanding elite tank units on the front lines. But while his military career was textbook, his personal correspondence wasn't. Letters from Wünsch to fellow officers, especially those written during downtime between battles, carry a tone that many historians have flagged as unusually tender. Not romantic in the obvious sense, but marked by affection, longing, and emotional language far beyond the cold detachment expected of SS men. In a regime obsessed with stoicism, Wünsch's warmth stood out. Was it just camaraderie? Maybe. The front lines blurred emotional boundaries, but the way he described certain comrades, with admiration that lingered just a second too long, made some researchers pause. Nothing explicit, nothing that would have raised alarms at the time, just a strange softness wrapped in a steel uniform. And when paired with his early closeness to Hitler's inner circle, it raises the question, how much was overlooked because someone liked having him around? That kind of protection didn't always last. Just ask the Nazi enforcer who built his career in Munich, and ended up surrounded by very different kinds of accusations. 16. Christian Weber. Christian Weber was a bruiser in a tailored suit. One of the original Munich street brawlers turned political operator, he parlayed loyalty and violence into a position of quiet power. He didn't give speeches. He didn't need to. His influence came from who feared him and who owed him. But local party rivals in Munich whispered other things. That Weber had a private life built on secrets. That he threw parties where the guest lists were selective and the mood was anything but political. That his alliances weren't just about ideology, but intimacy. None of it ever saw a courtroom, but the rumors followed him into every room. His enemies tried to use it against him, but Weber survived most purges with little more than a smirk. Maybe because he knew too much. Maybe because he wasn't the only one in on the game. In Nazi politics, hypocrisy wasn't a flaw. It was the glue. And behind every tough guy in the movement, there was often a softer, stranger mentor, the kind who shaped men more deeply than the ideology ever did. 17. Dietrich Eckart. Dietrich Eckart wasn't just an early Nazi, he was the early Nazi. A poet, playwright, and spiritual mentor to Hitler himself, Eckart infused the fledgling movement with a strange mix of mysticism, nationalism, and theatrical flair. But behind the ideological posturing was a man obsessed with male youth and what he called noble German masculinity, a phrase he used with unsettling frequency. He surrounded himself with younger male protégés, offering mentorship that blurred the line between guidance and fixation. His writings brimmed with idealized male friendship, intense emotional longing, and a recurring theme of redemptive male purity. Some saw this as old-school romanticism. Others read it as coded desire. Even among his peers there were hushed remarks about his attachments, his preferences, his need to be adored by men decades his junior. Whatever the truth, Eckart's vision of German destiny always centered on the male form, strong, pure, untouchable. His influence shaped Hitler's earliest views on masculinity, and in many ways, the entire aesthetic of Nazi power. But influence doesn't always mean control, and the men who broke from Eckart's mold sometimes became the ones the regime feared the most. 18. Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was the Nazi Party's inconvenient conscience, until they killed him. A powerful figure in the early 1930s, Strasser pushed for a more socialist version of National Socialism, one that clashed hard with Hitler's cult of personality. But beyond politics, another cloud followed him, the quiet but persistent rumor that he had unnatural relationships. Where the accusations came from is still debated. Some claim it was standard Nazi infighting, an attempt to weaken a rival through whispered disgrace. Others point to his preference for surrounding himself with young male aides, or the oddly intimate language in private memos. Like so many stories in this era, it was less about what was proven and more about what could be weaponized. Strasser's fall came during the Night of the Long Knives, where ideology wasn't the only thing purged. The gossip around him may not have mattered on paper, but in a regime where rumors became reasons, it was enough. And those reasons? They didn't stop with ideology or ambition. Some were as petty and as personal as jealousy wrapped in a uniform. 19. Hermann Fegelein. Hermann Fegelein was the kind of Nazi who always seemed to land on his feet, until he didn't. A flashy SS general with a talent for charm, politics, and social climbing, Fegelein rose through the ranks by aligning himself with power, not ideology. He married Eva Braun's sister. He danced at Berghof parties. He was, by all accounts, a man who knew how to perform loyalty. But behind the medals and marriages, rumors swirled. After the war, scattered testimonies suggested Fegelein may have had romantic entanglements that crossed Nazi taboos, including possible affairs with both men and women. The stories were inconsistent and unverifiable, but consistent in one thing. They painted a man who didn't draw lines where the regime demanded them. Fegelein's downfall came not from rumors, but from betrayal, abandoning his post in Berlin during the final days. He was executed for cowardice, not scandal. But even as he disappeared into Hitler's bunker history, the private whispers never really stopped. And for every opportunist like Fegelein, there was someone outside the Reich entirely, lobbing accusations back in, with a very different agenda. 20. Otto Strasser. Otto Strasser was the brother who said no. While Gregor tried to reform the Nazi Party from within, Otto went rogue, founding his own dissident version of National Socialism and publicly turning on Hitler long before it was fashionable. From exile, he became the regime's ideological heckler, publishing exposés and interviews that painted the Nazi elite as corrupt, decadent, and deeply hypocritical. One of his favorite weapons? Accusations of homosexuality. In interviews and memoirs, Otto claimed that numerous Nazi leaders, including Röhm, Hess, and even Hitler himself, were sexually compromised. His tone wasn't exactly supportive. He used queerness as a moral indictment, part of a broader attack on what he saw as the perversion of Germany's soul. Were his claims accurate? Some aligned with internal Nazi records. Others were pure provocation. Either way, they reveal a truth about the era: that queerness was weaponized from all sides. For Strasser, it wasn't a point of liberation. It was a tool of political warfare. And in the fog of that war, even the quiet Gauleiters, the regional kings of small empires, weren't immune to suspicion. 21. Friedrich Karl Florian. Friedrich Karl Florian ruled Dusseldorf like a fiefdom, equal parts bureaucrat and cult leader. As Gauleiter, he answered only to Hitler, and even that relationship was laced with self-importance. Florian wasn't a major military figure or policy architect. His power came from proximity and paranoia. He enforced ideological purity with a vengeance, often going further than anyone asked him to, as if trying to prove he belonged at a higher table. But those who worked closest with him noticed something else, something less definable. Florian kept an unusually tight inner circle of male adjutants, many of them young, many of them inexplicably favored. He gave gifts, showed personal concern, protected them from disciplinary action others would have faced. Staffers whispered about private meetings that stretched late into the night, about tone and touch that didn't quite match the hyper-masculine image he projected in public. None of this was public record. But in a regime where image was survival, even a whisper could make a man dangerous. Florian survived the war, unlike many of his peers, but his name was never quite clean again. And the deeper into the fringes we go, the stranger the stories become, especially when mysticism, Nazism, and unspoken identity collided in the mountains of France. 22. Otto Rahn. Otto Rahn was an SS officer who didn't look like one. He wasn't brutal, brawny, or obsessed with military protocol. He was a medievalist, a romantic academic obsessed with the Holy Grail, Cathars, and ancient ruins. Himmler found him fascinating, mostly because Rahn's obsessions aligned with the SS's bizarre mythic worldview. So Rahn was given a uniform, funding, and a mission: to go grail hunting across Europe, like a fascist Indiana Jones with fewer punches and more poetry. But Rahn didn't belong. Not really. He wore the uniform, but with reluctance. He drank too much, spent too much time alone, and surrounded himself with artists and men whose company was rarely considered political. More than one colleague in the SS noted how he avoided women, preferred male companionship, and spoke about love in abstract, veiled language. After his death, officially ruled accidental but shrouded in mystery, several biographers concluded that Rahn may have been gay, and that his death had more to do with internal pressures than the cold. Heinrich Himmler tried to erase him from the record. But Rahn's legend persisted, an outsider within a machine that couldn't tolerate difference. And if Rahn left behind rumors and poetry, the next figure published stories that whispered even louder. 23. Hans Grimm. Hans Grimm was the regime's literary darling, the man who gave Nazi Germany one of its most enduring slogans: Volk ohne Raum, a people without space. He wasn't a politician or a soldier, but he helped craft the ideological fantasy that justified conquest. His novels painted a world of struggle, purity, and German destiny. But between the battle scenes and bloodlines, something else emerged, a fixation with male friendship so intense it bordered on the obsessive. Grimm's male characters were strong, noble, and almost always bound by deep emotional ties. These relationships, written with more tenderness than any of his sparse portrayals of women, often formed the emotional spine of his stories. It wasn't overt, but it wasn't subtle either. The camaraderie felt romantic, the admiration nearly devotional. Readers noticed. So did critics. Was Grimm projecting? Possibly. He never married, kept his personal life notoriously guarded, and cultivated intense one-on-one mentorships with younger male writers. No scandal ever surfaced, but the patterns in his fiction invited quiet speculation. And that's the irony. The man who helped mythologize German masculinity may have been writing about something far more personal, But Grimm's passions lived in metaphor. Others weren't so poetic. Some wrapped their contradictions in uniforms and violence. 24. Lothar Streicher. Lothar Streicher isn't as famous as his grotesque namesake Julius, but his career followed a similarly dark trajectory. An SA figure operating in the thick of party rivalries, Lothar rose through the stormtrooper ranks during a time when power was fluid, favors were traded, and accusations were currency. His downfall, like so many in the SA, came not from battlefield failure, but from whispers. Several of those whispers focused on his relationships with younger stormtroopers. Internal rivals accused him of inappropriate conduct behind closed doors, an accusation so common during the SA purges it bordered on cliché. Whether true or not never mattered. In 1934, the regime wasn't looking for justice, it was looking for leverage. And Streicher, like others who exhibited too much closeness, too little discretion, or just too much loyalty to Röhm, was expendable. It was a pattern. The same men who were useful in the party's rise were eliminated when their presence became inconvenient. Sexuality wasn't the crime, it was the excuse. But not every accusation came from inside the party. Some names slipped into infamy because their actions were so extreme, even the regime struggled to explain them. 25. Oskar Dirlewanger. Oskar Dirlewanger was the Nazi regime's dirtiest secret, the man they called when they needed something done that no one wanted to admit to authorizing. As commander of the Dirlewanger Brigade, a penal unit composed of criminals and sadists, Dirlewanger waged war like a man completely untethered from civilization. Even among Nazis, he was spoken of in lowered tones. His brutality was so extreme that SS leaders, no strangers to atrocity, occasionally requested investigations into his conduct. But he kept getting reinstated, protected, used. Why? Possibly because he was useful. Possibly because he knew too much. Possibly because no one wanted to be the one responsible for cleaning up the mess he embodied. Rumors about Dirlewanger's personal life were as horrifying as his battlefield conduct. Among them were suggestions of sexual violence, including accusations involving male captives. Most historians agree these were part of a wider pattern of deviance, though the details are contested or deliberately buried. But even if half of what was said about him is myth, the myths themselves say something. That Dirlewanger represented everything the Nazis claimed to stand against, yet continued to reward. In him, the contradiction of the regime reached its grotesque endpoint, a movement obsessed with purity, hiding behind monsters. But what if the real secret wasn't just in the monsters, but in the ones who fed them, praised them, and quietly resembled them more than they'd ever admit?